regards to going after bots, which we know from our previous studies helping amplify a lot of that disinformation. We heard about, bots and troll farms really trying to push all this stuff, which is causing a lot of havoc in our internal politics.
Dr. Luprecht, are you aware of what happened to my colleague Kenny Chiu in the last election, primarily because he introduced a bill to propose making this foreign influence registry?
Thank you. And who do they tend to exploit? I mean, can you speak to a specific demographic? Can you speak to a specific kind of sense of on the political spectrum, not partisan, but broadly on the political? Who do these foreign actors in spreading this misinformation? Who do they tend to exploit?
That line between honoring freedom of expression, a charter-held right, but also holding social media companies accountable for their role in providing a platform for this kind of disinformation to spread. Do you have any recommendations on some of the proactive things our committee can recommend vis-a-vis social media platforms? Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's striking to me with the Russia study that we're currently engaged in how much of a crossover there is with our recently concluded IMVE study, especially foreign state actors' roles in helping sow disinformation. Because if you are causing that kind of level of disturbance within a country's internal politics, of course, it's going to cause a great amount of distraction. Mr. Schull, in your opening remarks, you were talking about automated traffic. How we really need to step up and go after the bots. Ultimately, what I'm interested in as a parliamentarian is producing a comprehensive report with some solid recommendations for what the federal government can be doing. Can you maybe expand on that and maybe provide a specific recommendation of what you want to see the federal government do with regards to going after bots, which we know from our previous studies helping amplify a lot of that disinformation? We heard about bots and troll farms really trying to push all this stuff, which is causing a lot of havoc in our internal politics.
Sure. So I mentioned two things, but let me go into them in greater detail. And just for the purposes of clarity, there's a troll. That's a person. Yeah. Then there's bots, and those are actually robots, but they work together. So the trolls control the bots, and there's actually what they call cyborgs. That's when trolls manipulate bot armies and redirect them. So the point that I was making earlier is that troll wants to get paid. And so just make it harder for them to get paid. And we've already got the system in place through the sanctions, right? So you've got proof of concept there. No one wakes up in the morning, like I said, with a sense of civic duty to run a troll farm. They want to get a paycheck. Make it harder for them to get that paycheck. And that will lower the amount of amplification that takes place. And then the second thing we talked about is there's no widely received definition of what is a bad bot. So we have to work with allied states to determine what that is. And then we have to put in place a mechanism through kind of collective action to both leverage those sanctions and then go after the technical architecture, work with the internet governance agencies. So there's something called ICANN, and I won't get into the details of that right here, but go after the technical architecture and make sure that the big farms don't resolve. And
making sure that social media companies are accountable as well, because a lot of this is happening on their networks.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean that's table stakes. You got to make sure that they're paying attention to that as well.
Perfect.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question for Mr. Schull. Are you aware of my former colleague Kenny Chiu's private member's bill to establish a foreign influence registry in Canada before the last election?
Yeah, it rings a bell. I couldn't cite a chapter and verse right now, though.
Are you aware of other countries that have foreign influence registries, and do you have a comment on whether or not they're useful tools?
I think it depends on how you scope it, and I appreciated your questions to the previous witnesses. I'm not an expert in it, so I don't want to steer you in the wrong direction. Okay. I think obviously foreign influence is a bad thing. We've got to be on top of it, but there's different ways of approaching it.
Maybe I'll flip over to Dr. Luprecht. Dr. Luprecht, are you aware of what happened to my colleague Kenny Chiu in the last election, primarily because he introduced a bill to propose making this foreign influence registry?
I'm aware of some of the online activity that was directed at your colleague, and I also believe that activity had a material influence on the outcome in that particular writing. So
there was a McGill study, I'm sure you might be aware of it, that said, the overall election, they said it didn't have a material impact, but at certain riding levels, they can't discount that it had a material impact on the election. Would you say that he was one of the ridings, primarily because he brought forward this bill that was targeted by foreign disinformation campaigns to defeat a candidate, an incumbent candidate in a Canadian election.
Yeah, I think it clearly undermined our democracy, and it was quite nefarious because the activity, as you well know, was conducted in language in neither English nor French. It was primarily conducted in a third language, a language in which our security, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies have rather limited capabilities. Nor did we have a plan of how we would actively identify such influence activity and be able to counter it. And so, yes, it was. I think it is a canary in the coal mine of what any member of parliament faces.
Can you speak to a specific demographic? Can you speak to a specific kind of sense of on the political spectrum, not partisan, but broadly on the political? Who do these foreign actors in spreading this misinformation? Who do they tend to exploit, and what do they tend to amplify to do exactly what you've just talked about, which is to undermine institutions in Canada? Is there a trend that you've seen?
Well, I would say the trend that we've certainly seen is an uptick in both people who sympathize with views on the extremes of the political spectrum, so say the extreme left and also the extreme right. The challenge with the growing sympathies on the extreme right is that unlike the sympathies on the extreme left, they tend to be actively associated with incitement to violence, with seditious activities, and with other active engagement to undermine our institutions and our government. And this is why I think it is embarrassing that the government of Canada has not called a royal commission into the incidents of what transpired in February, which was the single greatest failure of our national security infrastructure in decades. And I think it is embarrassing that we are not having an open and honest conversation to identify precisely the sort of sources and the sort of causes that you've just identified and the sort of influence that that had on what effectively brought a democratic capital of a G7 country to a standstill for 3 weeks.
Just leaning into this a little bit, in the United States, we have seen the devastating impact to democratic institutions when political actors and political players start to lean into this very same narrative. Are you concerned at all that that's starting to happen in Canada? And how should we all, across party lines, as parliamentarians, work together to stop it, if it is in fact an issue?
I think parliamentarians need to be very careful not to sympathize with activity that is criminal or that is clearly illegal. And I think when we start to blur those boundaries, we get ourselves into trouble. At the same time, I think we're starting to get ourselves into trouble where we get these wink, wink, nudge, nudge sort of hints from governments in terms of to police, in terms of don't go too hard on these protesters because we're sympathetic to them, but go hard on those protesters because we're not sympathetic to them. And I think we need a multi-partisan consensus to make sure that the law is enforced equally and equitably in terms of the rule of law in this country, so that law enforcement always has intelligence, has clear direction into what its approach needs to be. And I'm deeply concerned the extent to which we are increasingly politicizing, especially law enforcement activities in this country, because of the extent to which sympathies a government might have for these protesters or those protesters, instead of drawing a clear line. If a protest is illegal, let alone if a protest is criminal, then we need to let the rule of law take its course.
Do you have any recommendations on some of the proactive things we can be recommending? Because one of the things we've been struggling with as a committee is that line between honoring freedom of expression, a charter-held right, but also holding social media companies accountable for their role in providing a platform for this kind of disinformation to spread. Do you have any recommendations on some of the proactive things our committee can recommend vis-a-vis social media platforms?
You might want to look at the current engagement by the Privacy Commission of Canada, as well as the BC Information and Privacy Commissioner with regards to Facebook, that demonstrates the extreme weakness of our privacy legislation and the inability of the Privacy Commissioner to levy real, meaningful fines against companies that willfully violate that are willfully found to be violating Canadian law and legislation, even though that law might be decades out of date. So there's certainly certainly significant elements that can be done here. I would also encourage the committee to look at the Australian process of the Richardson Review. I recently wrote a whole book on this, Intelligence as Democratic Statecraft. Australia has a 5-year review led by a judge of its entire national security intelligence architecture. Those reports are up to 1,200 pages in length. They are extremely detailed, and as a result, Australia is able to engage in precisely the sort of systematic overhaul that we have not seen.
Thank you very much. Thank you.